The Anomalous Artifacts Agency, or AAA as it is better known, is purely a work of fiction. There is not, never was, and never will be such an organization in the world because there is really no such things as anomalous artifacts, anomalous organisms, anomalous persons, or anomalous forces. At least, as far as I know, anyway. The AAA is a creation of mine, Terry Polino, better known to all of you as Natural Juan. All rights reserved. I'm doing this because I'm worried some of you might get the hot idea that this stuff might actually be real, like what happened with Slender Man, and do horrible things in real life with my work as an excuse. TLDR. This is all just an elaborate joke. None of it is real. I will be very disappointed if some of you actually believe any of this. Anyway, here's a quick shout out to Mr. Jonathan Green, a longtime supporter of this channel. Special mention as well for our sponsor Dermhaven with Miss Rochelle Pineda. Don't let your complexion burn to a crisp and let Dermhaven provide you with all the skincare that you need. Also, a word of gratitude for our supervisors at my workplace, Boss A and Boss Mario. And congratulations to Rochelle Augustin and Gason Pasal for their recent promotions. Lastly, I would also like to acknowledge Neb Caro and his channel Pinoy Creepypasta, which is where I got the idea for this particular story. Okay now, hold tight to your seats and grab your favorite drink because things are about to heat up. The following information was taken from the personal journal of AP Sigma 777, codenamed Chance. I really don't know why, but Acme and Zhangwo have forced me into chronicling the various cases I've taken over the years with or without the other insurmountables. They say that I have to somehow keep records and that my anomalous traits are very useful in these kinds of situations. Ha! Thing is, I'm not even convinced that I even have anomalous traits. I don't even know how I even became an insurmountable. That said, I guess I'm already here and I might as well give what information I can to help the others. Heck, I don't know. It might actually save someone's life for all we know. Anyway, all this happened before I went and joined the Insurmountables. Or rather, before Zhang Wo came and asked me to join. I was pretty much just another janitor then in the Starside Hotel. Just another guy trying to make a living. All that changed of course when I went to the roof to the little storage shed where they kept some of the other cleaning equipment. I ascended the stairs and opened the door to the rooftop, expecting to see what I had always seen when I went up there. Simple concrete pavement, ventilation fans, the little shack that served as my home, a small basketball half-court, the 10-foot tall chain-link fence that surrounded the place to prevent people from falling off, and the little shed with the extra equipment. Nothing but the stormy dark sky above and the gritty and noisy streets below. What was different though was that there was a familiar female figure who was scaling the fence on the edges of the roof and was halfway to the top. I shouted in alarm at the woman climbing the fence, and she turned towards me. It was Tessa Fabian, one of the young concierges at the Starside Hotel. She had been working here for more than a year now, and the other staff members, including myself, had gotten to know her quite a bit already. She was the second and youngest daughter of Jessie Fabian, wife and secretary of the late attorney Albert Fabian here in Baguio City. She had an older sister by the name of Megan, who worked as a school teacher at a private school near the heart of the city. Her father, Albert, was one of the most renowned lawyers of the city, who sometimes took cases for impoverished defendants who were too poor to afford an attorney of their own, but had died 3 years ago due to a possible reprisal from individuals he worked against. While her family managed to stay afloat in the first 2 years after her father's death, things took a dip for them in the third. I didn't know the details, but her mother had to sell some of her father's belongings, and her sister had to work part-time as a manager at a fast food restaurant to make ends meet. On the rooftop of the hotel, amid the strong wind and the bustling noise of the traffic below, I saw a different side to Tessa. Crushing hopelessness. I saw in her teary eyes a kind of resignation that said she had already given up. Her hands and feet clung tightly to the chain-link fence, and she was halfway to its top, which was about 5 more feet above her. Since all 24 floors of the Starside Hotel added up to 360 feet, and the chain-link fence added another 10, it would be a long fall if Tessa chose to jump off from the top. I shouted at her to stop and asked her what she was doing. She didn't answer me, and, much to my horror, she turned away and continued to climb the chain-link fence. At that moment, I dropped everything that I was holding and ran straight for her. The highest part of the fence was at her waist when I jumped and grabbed one of her ankles. About 15 minutes later, during lunch break, I sat with Tessa at a nearby eatery. I suppose the word for it in English is dining kiosk, or at least the Americans would. The Japanese would probably understand it better though, since they have something like outdoor bars that look similar. I should ask that old man Kogane Shogun when we both have free time. Whatever the case, I ordered a bowl of porridge and a cup of coffee for Tessa to warm her guts and return a semblance of normalcy to her troubled thoughts. She was an attractive and almost always professional young woman, and seeing her in the state she was in made me feel very sad. She looked like she had lost her mind. Thankfully, though, the coffee and porridge did their thing. While I could still see the fear in her eyes, a sense of calm came over the woman. She had been sobbing for hours now, and mumbling unintelligibly about something burning and a hateful fire. It seemed that feeding her something warm would calm her down enough so she could speak more coherently and tell me more about what had happened to her, and if there was something that could still be done to help her. When she finally calmed down enough to be able to talk properly, I asked her what had happened. She spoke slowly and hesitantly at first, looking over her shoulders as if expecting someone, or perhaps even something, to suddenly come out of nowhere and attack her. As she talked more, however, her speech sped up, and her words became more detailed, making for a truly interesting and very disturbing tale. Just ask the girl at the kiosk, who was riveted to what Tessa had to say. It began, Tessa said, when her sister Megan had been invited to see a faith healer of sorts in the city. Calling herself the Light Bringer, this faith healer was thought to be able to cure all kinds of illnesses and ailments with a mere touch. In fact, people not just all over the Philippines, but from other countries as well sought out this Light Bringer to heal themselves of their various diseases and health concerns. Megan thought it was a good idea to bring their mother Jessie to the faith healer because she thought there might still be a way to cure Mrs. Fabian of her debilitating depression. Tessa told us that Jessie had been afflicted with a heavy depression since their father died. They hid it well from the public, of course, but in private, it was actually really bad. Mrs. Fabian often lost sleep over her condition and rarely got more than 4 hours of sleep every day. She did her best to keep house, but often looked disheveled and would sometimes forget what she was doing in the first place, leaving her home in a mess that was the same as when she started. Tessa and Megan had tried everything to cheer their mother up, They tried to redecorate their home with new colors and figurines. They had gone on a few vacations with her to places like Boracay, the islands of Batanes at the northern tip of the Philippines, and to Disneyland Hong Kong. They even tried to match her up with a wealthy and handsome lover from Manila. However, none of those worked. When I asked Tessa if they ever thought of taking Jessie to a professional psychologist or psychiatrist, she said neither she nor Megan had ever thought about it. They were worried that even merely suggesting it to their mother would make her mad, since she might think that they believe she's crazy or something. I shook my head at that, since I knew all too well the backwards way of thinking that was prevalent in the Philippines, and how the concept of mental health was poorly understood among Filipinos. The faith healer, known as the Lightbringer, was their last hope, or so Megan had told her sister, and so she went on the off chance that there would be a way to help their mother recover. Tessa herself was skeptical at first, and would be proven right at the end, but as it started, the results of their visit to the Lightbringer was to the point of being miraculous. Jessie Fabian became more lively, could work efficiently in their house, and, most of all, no longer debilitated by the loss of her husband. She seemed to be constantly happy, and often went out with the girls on trips that often involved them visiting the Lightbringer at some point. While Tessa was certainly happy that her mother had seemingly recovered from her condition, there were a number of strange things that they had to do. For one thing, the Lightbringer sold them a bunch of candles which she insists were beeswax, which they were to always keep alight in their home. This was quite odd, Tessa noted, since aside from being a little expensive, they were also told not to ever let the candles go out in their home, and even encouraged to light multiple candles in all of their rooms to make sure that there was at least one candle that was lit in each room. The Lightbringer also discouraged them from having open windows to the outside, and sold to them a number of equally expensive thick curtains with strange designs that the faith healer said would keep negative energy and evil spirits from entering their home. This led to the interior of the Fabian home becoming uncharacteristically dark all the time, since the curtains were too thick to allow any sunlight through them. The only thing that kept any illumination in their home were their electric lights and, of course, the Lightbringer's candles. To make matters even stranger, the faith healer also discouraged them from using any electronic devices like televisions, computers, or their own phones, claiming that these could be used as tools of the enemy to further misguide them and lead them to sin. Also, after doing a bit of research, Tessa noticed a few things that seemed out of place. Beeswax candles, as far as she knew, were colored yellow and gave off a brightly burning but otherwise normal color of flame. The candles the Lightbringer provided were pale white, almost appearing to resemble porcelain. What truly disturbed Tessa, though, was that the flames they produced were always a bright pale white in color. She didn't know what they were really made of, and both their smell and their light irritated Tessa's nose and eyes, respectively. There was something wrong with the curtains, too. While the Lightbringer claimed that she was a Christian, and even went so far as to claim that she was a modern prophet of Christ, the symbols on the curtains she provided them only resembled Christian symbolism with crosses and the tongues of fire that Tessa at first thought represented the Holy Spirit during Pentecost. However, upon closer inspection, the crosses looked odd and appeared more like swords or daggers. Also, the tongues of fire had patterns in them that made them look like screaming or howling faces. Tessa then hesitated for a moment, seemingly unsure of how to continue, but then decided to proceed. Thanks to the way the outside was sealed off by the strange curtains, the air inside their home became as dark and dank as a cave. The only thing that shed any light in their house were those awful candles that seemed to distort Tessa's sense of sight and smell. She would bring this detail up with her mother and sister, but would only be met by dismissal and the idea that if she was truly faithful, she would not mind such things. Megan even got angry and admonished her, saying, wasn't she happy that their mother was no longer depressed? And so things would go on as they were, but would steadily get worse. I then began to understand why Tessa was so hesitant to proceed, and that was because she began to discuss things that defied logic. Things that, simply put, were crazy and very likely supernatural in nature. First, there were the odd smells. While they seemed to be ordinary candles, save for the strange white flame, there was an awful stench that wafted from them. They reeked of burnt human flesh, to the point that they were attracting flies into the house. This last was probably the strangest, since weren't candles supposed to drive away flies instead of attracting them? That wasn't all though. The flies didn't appear to be normal-looking flies, but were large, hairy, and fat, with red eyes and crimson stripes on their pulsing black bodies. They were like fireflies, Tessa said, but there was nothing benign or natural about them. What faint light they produced was blood red, and the feelings they inspired were a sense of impending danger and disgust. These flies would always appear around the candles and buzz around rooms, feeding on carcasses of dead rats and lizards in the house, and laying their vile maggots in them. Worst of all was that the maggots were blood red in color, like pieces of animated meat. This led to Tessa naming them gore flies, which I think is rather appropriate. Another very strange sign were the visions or possible hallucinations that Tessa would see around the house. She would see a woman in a black wedding dress that sometimes appeared all around the house. She would only see her from the corner of her eyes by day, but at night she would see the strange bride in black in plain sight in the house. When I asked how both Jessie and Megan could allow for this to happen, Tessa just told me that they seemed to have been thoroughly hypnotized by the faith healer and her strange candles. She had in fact spoken out against the Lightbringer multiple times, stating that she was scamming them since the candles and curtains she provided were so expensive that they could no longer afford some of their basic necessities. For instance, they could no longer pay for their electric and water bills, now only relying on the candlelight provided to them by the Lightbringer, and using an old well from the back of their home that disgusted Tessa. Most disturbing, though, was how her mother, who would be later joined by her sister, would claim that they could see Albert, their father, in the flames of the candles. They even went so far as to claim that the late attorney would even speak to them through his image in the candle flames, comforting them for his loss and instructing them to follow the words of the Lightbringer if they wanted to continue seeing him. However, when Tessa looked at the candle flames, all she saw were patterns of skull-like faces who were either screaming in agony or howling in terror. For that reason, Tessa often avoided looking at them for any length of time. Due to her skepticism, Jessie and Megan became less and less friendly towards her. It got to the point that they began to hate her and treat her less like a family member and more like just a tenant in her own home. She simply went to work in the morning, went home in the evening, and slept in her bed in order to repeat the same action the next day without saying a word to her mother or sister since they never spoke to her anyway. She simply didn't feel safe in her house, as there would even be times when she would see the bride in black in her own room, staring at her from the foot of her bed or right beside her upon waking up. Most disturbing was how her mother and sister had become warped and corrupted due to the indoctrination of the Lightbringer. Again, while the faith healer liked to claim that she was some sort of instrument of God on earth, the insanity she seemed to inspire made it highly questionable. An example would be how Jesse and Megan would ritually burn themselves on the candles to, according to them anyway, please God, which was taught to them by the Lightbringer. When Tessa showed that she was not affected or convinced by the Lightbringer's mumbo-jumbo, Jesse and Megan brought her before the faith healer, hoping that she could somehow be convinced. Tessa played along at first, thinking that she could disprove the Lightbringer's claims by showing that she was not at all affected by the latter's so-called healing. The Lightbringer, a small woman with thin limbs, a pale complexion, and striking Asian features, then touched her hand to her head and began to act as if she was being electrocuted. She trembled as if she had touched an electric outlet with wet hands, and her eyes rolled back in her head. Tessa had to hold back from laughing, as it reminded her too much of a classmate in high school who had to pretend he was having a seizure during a school play. The Lightbringer then declared Tessa a hopeless case, and went so far as to claim that she was not just possessed by demons, but that she had now become one with them. According to the Lightbringer, she would now bring nothing but misfortune and sorrow upon their family because Tessa was an unbeliever. Tessa, while alarmed, had to stop herself from laughing because of how much the faith healer acted like some old character in a horror film, trying to warn people about a haunted house or some cursed jewel. From then on, Tessa's relationship with her mother and sister changed drastically. There was also the curious and creepy thing about how Jesse and Megan seemed to have gained an aversion to Christianity, even though the Lightbringer claimed she was going to bring them closer to Christ. First off was how Tessa's mother and sister began to hate Christian church music. I knew the Fabian family were supposed to belong to the Baptist church, and while I myself am Catholic, I knew that all hymns and songs that praised Jesus Christ were prayers to the Almighty in their own right. Also, whenever Tessa tried to pray, Jesse and Megan would often get angry and stop her. Like I said, being Catholic, I don't know that much about Baptist practices, but I found this last to be really strange and possibly alarming. After all, the only one I know who would be offended at prayer is a being that opposes God. You guys probably know what I'm talking about. Indeed, it got to the point where Megan broke the cross in Tessa's room, and Jessie destroyed her wireless speakers when she was playing church music through her phone. They threw her out of their home, apparently, after she played the church music in her house at maximum volume. She said she did this to somehow banish whatever the bride in black was from their home, since the latter had become quite aggressive towards her and began strangling her in her sleep. Instead, Tessa was banished from her own home by her mother and sister, who now seemed they had completely lost themselves to religious mania. They went so far as to curse and bully Tessa for apparently bringing misfortunes and troubles upon their family. What truly hurt Tessa, though, was that they went so far as to claim that she was somehow responsible for the death of the father of the family, Albert, due to her unbelief. This was what led Tessa to the point that she was willing to take her own life. I told her then that I would take a look at what was going on and I would see what I could do to help. I told her then and there to take me to her home, or former home in this case, and I would see what I could do to help her and her family.